Psychological Test. By Edogawa Rampo. Why Fukiya Seikiro conceived of the terrifying crime described below is unknown. Even if the motive were known, it's largely irrelevant to this story. Given that he was struggling to pay his way through university, one might assume financial difficulties. He was an exceptionally bright student, remarkably diligent, and it's certain he resented any menial part-time work that took away from his beloved reading and contemplation. However, would such a reason drive someone to commit such a heinous act? Perhaps he was inherently evil. Perhaps he was driven by desires beyond mere tuition. In any case, 6 months had passed since the idea first took hold. During that time, he wrestled with his thoughts, and ultimately resolved to carry it out. One day, a chance encounter led to a friendship with a classmate, Saito Izumu. This was the beginning. Initially, there was no ulterior motive. However, Fukiya gradually approached Saito with a vague objective in mind. As they grew closer, this vague objective became clearer. For about a year, Saito had rented a room in a quiet, residential area. The landlady, a widow nearing 60, had enough income from the rental properties left by her late husband to live comfortably. Childless, she found immense pleasure in saying, "Money is all I have," and lending small sums to trusted acquaintances, slowly increasing her savings. She rented a room to Saito partly for security in her otherwise all-female household, but also because even a small rent increased her monthly savings. Though rarely heard these days, she was rumored to hoard a considerable sum of cash in a secret location at home, in addition to her official bank deposits. A miser's psychology seemingly universal across time and place. It was this money that tempted Fukiya. What good was that old woman having such a fortune? Using it for the education of a promising young man like himself was perfectly rational, or so he reasoned. He sought to learn as much as he could about the old woman through Saito, especially the secret hiding place of her fortune. However, he hadn't formed any concrete plan until one day, Saito happened to discover the hiding place. "You know, it's quite clever for that old lady. Most people hide money under floorboards or in the attic, but hers is in a surprising spot. You see that large potted maple tree in the alcove of the back room? It's in the bottom of the pot. No thief would ever think to look there. You could say she's a genius miser." Saito chuckled. From that moment, Fukiya's thoughts began to solidify. He considered every possibility, exploring every avenue for transferring the old woman's money to his own account, seeking the safest method. It was more challenging than he anticipated, more complex than any mathematical problem. As mentioned, he spent 6 months perfecting his plan. The biggest hurdle, needless to say, was how to avoid punishment. Ethical obstacles, pangs of conscience, were not a significant concern for him. Just as he admired Napoleon's large-scale killings without considering them evil, he felt justified in sacrificing a woman with one foot in the grave to further his own talents. The old woman rarely left her home, spending her days quietly in the back room. Even on her rare outings, a naive maid, following her instructions, diligently stood guard. Despite Fukiya's efforts, the old woman's vigilance remained impenetrable. He initially considered tricking the maid into running an errand while both the old woman and Saito were out, using the opportunity to steal the money from the pot. But this was foolish. Even being alone in the house for a short time would be enough to raise suspicion. He spent a month devising and discarding various such plans, framing Saito, the maid, or an ordinary burglar, sneaking in silently and unseen while the maid was alone, working during the night while the old woman slept. Every scenario carried significant risk of discovery. He had to eliminate the old woman. He finally reached this terrifying conclusion. Although he didn't know the exact amount, from various indications, it didn't seem large enough to justify the risk of murder. Wasn't it too cruel to kill an innocent person for a relatively small sum? But even if it wasn't a fortune by societal standards, it was more than enough for the impoverished Fukiya. Moreover, in his mind, the amount wasn't the issue, it was about making discovery absolutely impossible. Any sacrifice was acceptable to achieve that. Murder, at first glance, seems far more dangerous than simple theft. But that's an illusion. Certainly, if discovery is expected, murder is the most dangerous of all crimes. However, if the ease of discovery, rather than the severity of the crime, is the primary consideration, then in some cases, like Fukiya's, theft is actually riskier. Eliminating the witness, while cruel, eliminates the worry. Great villains of history committed murder without hesitation and often evaded capture, perhaps precisely because of their audacity. So, was there no risk in killing the old woman? Fukiya pondered this for months. How his thoughts evolved during that time will become clear as the story progresses. Suffice it to say, with meticulous analysis and synthesis beyond the comprehension of ordinary people, he devised a foolproof, perfectly safe method. Now, all that remained was to wait for the right moment. And it arrived sooner than expected. One day, it was confirmed that both Saito and the maid would be away on errands, not returning until evening. This was 2 days after Fukiya had completed his final preparations. These preparations, which must be explained beforehand, involved confirming, 6 months after learning about the hiding place from Saito, that it remained unchanged. 2 days before the murder, he visited Saito and, for the first time, entered the old woman's back room, engaging her in casual conversation. He subtly steered the conversation toward her finances and the rumors of her hidden wealth. Every time he mentioned hiding, he observed her eyes. As he expected, her gaze flickered towards the potted plant in the alcove, now a pine, not a maple. He repeated this several times, eliminating any doubt. Indent 8 characters too. The day arrived. He donned his university uniform, student cap, and mantle, and ordinary gloves, and set off. After careful consideration, he chose not to disguise himself. A disguise would require procuring materials, finding a place to change, creating various opportunities to leave clues. It would only complicate matters without any benefit. His philosophy was that the method should be as simple and overt as possible, within the bounds of avoiding detection. The key was not to be seen entering the house. Even if seen passing by, it wouldn't matter. He often strolled in the neighborhood, and could claim he had been doing so that day. Moreover, should he encounter someone he knew en route, a possibility he couldn't ignore, it was clearly better to be in his usual attire than a suspicious disguise. As for the timing, why choose risky daylight when he knew there would be opportune nights with both Saito and the maid absent? This, too, was part of his strategy to remove unnecessary secrecy. However, standing before the house, even Fukiya, like any ordinary thief, or perhaps even more so, anxiously scanned his surroundings. The old woman's house was a standalone building, separated from its neighbors by hedges. Across the street stood the tall concrete wall of a wealthy estate, stretching for a good distance. It was a quiet neighborhood, often deserted even during the day. As luck would have it, not a soul was in sight when Fukiya arrived. He carefully opened and closed the latticed gate, which would normally screech metallically, making no sound. Then, from the entranceway, he called out softly, as a precaution against the neighbors. When the old woman appeared, he claimed to have a private matter to discuss regarding Saito and was ushered into the back room. Soon after they were seated, the old woman excused herself to prepare tea, saying, "Unfortunately, the maid is out." Fukiya had been waiting for this moment. As she bent slightly to open the sliding door, he suddenly embraced her from behind, his gloved hands tightening around her neck with all his might. Though gloved, he tried to avoid leaving finger marks. The old woman made a single gurgling sound and offered little resistance. Her flailing hand brushed against a standing folding screen, slightly tearing it. It was an antique, 2-paneled gold screen depicting the 6 immortal poets, and Ono no Komachi's face was unfortunately torn about an inch. After confirming her death, he laid the body down and anxiously examined the tear in the screen. But upon reflection, there was no cause for concern. Such a thing could hardly be considered evidence. He went to the alcove, grasped the base of the pine, and pulled the entire plant and its soil from the pot. As expected, an oilcloth-wrapped package lay at the bottom. Calmly, he unwrapped it, took a large new wallet from his right pocket, and transferred about half the banknotes, at least 5,000 yen, into it. He returned the wallet to his pocket, rewrapped the remaining banknotes in the oilcloth, and hid them back in the bottom of the pot. This was to obscure the fact that money had been stolen. Only the old woman knew the exact amount of her savings. No one would suspect if it was halved. He then rolled up a cushion and placed it against the old woman's chest, to prevent blood spatter. From his left pocket, he took a jackknife, opened it, and plunged it into her heart, twisting it deeply before withdrawing it. He carefully wiped the blade on the same cushion, and returned it to his pocket. He feared strangulation alone might not be enough, so he delivered the coup de grâce, as they used to say. He hadn't used the knife initially for fear of getting blood on his clothes. A brief explanation is needed regarding the wallet and the jackknife. He purchased both from a stall at a local festival. He chose the busiest time and the most crowded stall, paid the asking price in small change, grabbed the items, and vanished before the vendor, or any of the numerous customers, could register his face. Both items were utterly commonplace, without distinguishing marks. After carefully checking that he had left no trace, Fukiya quietly exited through the front door, remembering to close the sliding doors behind him. He paused to tie his shoelaces, considering his footprints. But there was no problem there either. The entranceway floor was hard plaster, and the street outside was dry from continued fine weather. Only opening the latticed gate and stepping outside remained. But failing here would render all his efforts meaningless. He listened intently for any sounds from the street. Silence. Only the peaceful, tinkling sound of a koto being played somewhere nearby. He resolutely opened the gate, and, with the casual air of a departing visitor, stepped onto the street. As hoped, it was deserted. The surrounding streets were all quiet residential areas. 4 or 5 blocks from the old woman's house, an old stone wall of a shrine ran alongside the street. After making sure he wasn't observed, Fukiya dropped the jackknife and bloody gloves into a crevice in the wall. He then strolled towards a small nearby park, a usual stop on his walks. He sat on a bench, watching children play on the swings with a relaxed expression, passing a considerable amount of time. On his way back, he stopped by the police station. "I just found this wallet. It seems to contain quite a bit of money, so I'm turning it in," he said, presenting the wallet. He answered the officer's questions, giving the location and time where he found it, a plausible fabrication, and his name and address, genuine. He received a printed receipt with his name, the amount, and other details. This was certainly a roundabout method, but the safest. The old woman's money, no one knew it was halved, was still in its hiding place, so no one would claim the lost wallet. In a year, it would legally be his, to use openly without fear. He had carefully considered this. Hiding the wallet risked its discovery or theft by another. Keeping it himself was too dangerous. Moreover, this method eliminated any worry about the old woman having recorded the serial numbers of the banknotes, though he had investigated this and was reasonably sure she hadn't. Even Buddha wouldn't imagine someone turning in their stolen goods to the police, he chuckled to himself. The next day, Fukiya awoke in his rented room, stretched, yawned, and picked up the morning newspaper, scanning the social page. He was startled by an unexpected development, but it wasn't cause for alarm. Rather, it was an unforeseen stroke of luck. His friend, Saito, had been arrested as a suspect. The reason given was possession of a large sum of money inconsistent with his means. As Saito's closest friend, it's natural for me to go to the police and inquire, Fukiya reasoned. He quickly dressed and hurried to the station, the same one where he had turned in the wallet. Why hadn't he chosen a different station? That, too, was a deliberate act, in line with his principle of artless action. With a suitably concerned expression, he requested to see Saito. As expected, he was denied. He then inquired about the reasons for Saito's arrest. Piecing together the situation, Fukiya imagined the sequence of events. Saito had returned home before the maid, shortly after Fukiya had left. He discovered the body. But before reporting it, he had an idea: the potted plant. If a burglar was responsible, perhaps the money was gone. Out of curiosity, he checked. To his surprise, the money was still there. It was understandable, albeit foolish, that this tempted him. No one knew the hiding place, and it would surely be assumed that the murderer had taken the money. The circumstances presented an irresistible temptation. The police report stated that he had calmly reported the murder, the stolen money tucked inside his waistband. Apparently, he hadn't anticipated being searched on the spot. But wait, what will Saito's defense be? Depending on his approach, things could get dangerous. Fukiya considered the possibilities. Saito might claim the money was his. Since no one knew the extent or location of the old woman's savings, such a claim might hold up. But the amount was too large. He would eventually confess. But would the court believe him? With no other suspects, they were unlikely to acquit him. He might even be charged with murder. That would be ideal, but, as the judge questioned him, other facts would surface. Saito telling Fukiya about the hiding place, Fukiya's visit with the old woman 2 days before the murder, Fukiya's poverty and need for tuition money. But Fukiya had anticipated all of this. No matter how he considered it, he couldn't imagine Saito revealing anything more damaging. Returning from the police station, Fukiya ate his belated breakfast, recounting the events to the maid who served him, and went to school as usual. Saito was the talk of the campus. Fukiya, with a touch of pride, held court in the center of the gossip. Indent 8 characters 3. Now, readers versed in detective fiction know that the story doesn't end here. Indeed, this is merely the premise. What the author truly wishes you to read is what follows: how Fukiya's meticulously planned crime came unraveled. The examining magistrate assigned to the case was the renowned Mr. Kasamori. He was not only a competent judge but also a man of unusual hobbies, known for being an amateur psychologist. He often used his extensive psychological knowledge to solve otherwise intractable cases. Despite his relative youth and short career, he was an exceptionally talented magistrate. Everyone assumed the old woman's murder would be swiftly resolved in Kasamori's capable hands. Kasamori himself shared this confidence, intending to complete the investigation in the pre-trial hearings, leaving no loose ends for the trial. However, as the investigation progressed, the case proved more challenging than anticipated. The police asserted Saito's guilt, and Kasamori couldn't entirely dismiss their arguments. Everyone who had any connection to the old woman, whether debtor, tenant, or acquaintance, was summoned and thoroughly questioned, but no other suspect emerged. Fukiya, of course, was among them. With no other suspects, Saito, the most obvious candidate, had to be considered the culprit. Further incriminating Saito was his naturally timid nature. Intimidated by the courtroom, he responded hesitantly, frequently contradicting his earlier statements, forgetting things he should have known, and generally making a poor impression, deepening suspicion with every stammer. This was partly due to his guilt over stealing the money. Otherwise, the intelligent Saito would not have made such blunders. His situation was truly pitiable, yet Kasamori wasn't convinced of Saito's guilt as the murderer. There was only suspicion, no confession, and no concrete proof. A month passed, and the pre-trial hearings continued. Kasamori grew restless. Just then, the police chief brought encouraging news. On the day of the murder, a wallet containing over 5,200 yen had been found not far from the old woman's house. Due to an oversight, they had only just discovered that the person who turned it in was Fukiya Seikiro, Saito's close friend. Given that no one had claimed the wallet in a month, perhaps there was a connection. The chief offered this for consideration. The beleaguered Kasamori saw a glimmer of hope. Fukiya was immediately summoned. However, the questioning yielded little. When asked why he hadn't mentioned the wallet during his initial questioning, Fukiya replied that he hadn't thought it relevant to the murder. This was plausible. The old woman's money had been found on Saito. Why would anyone connect a lost wallet found on the street to her? But was it a coincidence that on the day of the murder, near the scene, a friend of the prime suspect, who, according to Saito, knew about the hiding place, found a large sum of money? Was this mere chance? Kasamori struggled to find a connection. He lamented the lack of serial numbers on the banknotes. That would have immediately confirmed whether the money was related to the case. Any small clue, anything concrete, he thought, exhausting all his abilities. The crime scene was revisited countless times. The old woman's family was thoroughly investigated. Nothing. Another half-month passed fruitlessly. The only remaining possibility, Kasamori thought, was that Fukiya had stolen half the money, returned the rest to its hiding place, put the stolen portion in the wallet, and pretended to find it. But was that plausible? The wallet itself offered no clues. And Fukiya calmly claimed to have passed the old woman's house on his walk that day. Would a murderer be so bold? Crucially, the murder weapon remained missing. A search of Fukiya's lodgings had yielded nothing. But Saito had no alibi for the weapon either. Who should he suspect? There was no definitive proof. Suspecting Saito, as the chief suggested, seemed reasonable, but Fukiya couldn't be ruled out either. After a month and a half of investigation, only these two remained as potential suspects. With all other avenues exhausted, Casamori decided to resort to his last resort, the psychological tests that had served him well in the past. He resolved to subject both suspects to this examination. Indent 8 characters 4. During his first summons, a few days after the murder, Fukiya learned that the examining magistrate was Casamori, the famed amateur psychologist. He was deeply unsettled, anticipating this possibility. Even he hadn't imagined that psychological tests, even as a personal hobby, were being conducted in Japan. He knew, perhaps too much, about psychological testing from his reading shaken. He could no longer maintain the pretense of attending classes and confined himself to his room, feigning illness. He devoted himself entirely to devising a way to overcome this obstacle, with an intensity equal to, or even surpassing, that of his planning for the murder itself. What kind of tests would Casamori employ? It was impossible to predict. Fukiya recalled every method he knew, desperately seeking countermeasures. But since psychological tests were designed to expose deception, further deception seemed theoretically impossible. In Fukiya's view, psychological tests fell into two categories: those based on physiological responses and those conducted through verbal exchange. The former involved the examiner asking questions related to the crime and recording subtle bodily reactions with specialized instruments, revealing truths undetectable through ordinary interrogation. This method relied on the theory that even if a person lies verbally or through facial expressions, their nervous system cannot conceal its excitement, which manifests in minute physical signs. Methods included using an automatograph to detect subtle hand movements, observing eye movements, using a pneumograph to measure breathing patterns, using a sphygmograph to measure pulse rate, using a plethysmograph to measure blood flow in the limbs, using a galvanometer to detect minute perspiration on the palms, observing muscle contractions in the knee reflex, and various other similar methods. For example, if suddenly asked, "You killed the old woman, didn't you?" he was confident he could reply calmly, "What evidence do you have for such an accusation?" But could he prevent his pulse from racing or his breathing from quickening? Was it truly impossible to control these reactions? He conducted mental experiments, imagining various scenarios. Strangely, questions he posed to himself, no matter how pointed or unexpected, didn't seem to elicit any physical response. Of course, lacking the instruments to measure subtle changes, he couldn't be certain, but since he felt no nervous excitement, he assumed there would be no corresponding physical manifestation. As he continued these experiments and speculations, a thought occurred to him. Could practice negate the effectiveness of psychological tests? In other words, would repeated exposure to the same question diminish the nervous response? Habituation. This seemed quite plausible, considering other phenomena. His lack of reaction to self-interrogation was likely due to anticipation. The question was already expected. He meticulously examined every entry in his dictionary, noting down every word remotely related to interrogation. He spent a week practicing his nervous responses to these words. Next were the verbal tests. These held no fear. Indeed, words were easier to manipulate. While there were various methods, the most common was the word association test, similar to the techniques used by psychoanalysts. The subject is presented with a series of unrelated words, sliding door, desk, ink, pen, air, and asked to respond as quickly as possible, without thinking, with the first word that comes to mind. For instance, sliding door might evoke window, sill, paper, or door. Any association is acceptable. Among these innocuous words, crime-related words like knife, blood, money, and wallet are inserted discreetly, and the subject's responses to these are analyzed. The most simple-minded might respond to potted plant with money, the association strongest in their mind due to the stolen money. Thus, they would inadvertently confess. A more cautious person, even if money came to mind, would suppress it and say, for instance, ceramic. There were two ways to detect such deception. One was to repeat the word list after a short interval. Natural responses would usually remain consistent, while fabricated responses would likely change. For example, the first response to potted plant might be ceramic, and the second soil. Another method was to precisely measure the response time. If the response to sliding door is door in 1 second, but the response to potted plant is ceramic in 3 seconds, though in reality, it's not so simple, it suggests a delayed response due to suppressing the initial association, raising suspicion. This delay might not manifest with the target word itself but with a subsequent, neutral word. Another technique involved having the subject recount the details of the crime. A guilty person, in retelling the story, might inadvertently deviate from the original narrative, revealing the truth in subtle details. Apologies to readers familiar with psychological testing for this tedious explanation. However, omitting it would render the story unclear to other readers. For these tests, practice was essential, but even more crucial, according to Fukiya, was artlessness, avoiding any clever tricks. To potted plant, it was safest to openly answer money or pine. Even if innocent, Fukiya, through the investigation, knew the details of the crime. The money in the pot's bottom was the most recent and significant impression, so such an association was natural. This strategy also ensured safety when recounting the crime scene. The only issue was response time. This required practice. He needed to be able to answer money or pine to potted plant instantly, without hesitation. He devoted several more days to this practice. His preparations were complete. He also considered another advantage. Even if faced with unexpected questions, or if his responses to anticipated questions were slightly unfavorable, he had nothing to fear. He wasn't the only one being tested. Could the highly strung Saito Izumu remain composed under questioning, even if innocent? He was likely to show similar reactions to Fukiya. As he considered these factors, Fukiya grew more confident. He felt almost eager for Kasumori's summons. Indent 8 characters v. The details of Kasumori's psychological tests and Saito's nervous responses, and Fukiya's composed demeanor, will be omitted. The narrative will proceed directly to the results. The day after the tests, as Kasumori sat in his study, puzzling over the written records, a card bearing the name Kogoro Akechi was presented. Readers of the case of the murder on D Hill will be somewhat familiar with Akechi. Since then, he had demonstrated his remarkable talents in numerous complex criminal cases, earning recognition from both experts and the public. He and Kasumori had become acquainted through a previous case. Akechi's smiling face appeared in the study, ushered in by the maid. This story takes place several years after D Hill, and he was no longer a student. "You seem quite busy," Akechi remarked, glancing at the papers on the desk. "Yes, I'm quite stumped this time," Kasumori replied, turning to face his guest. "The old woman's murder, I presume. How did the psychological tests go?" Akechi had been following the case closely, discussing it with Kasumori several times. "The results are clear," Kasumori said, "but I can't quite make sense of them. Yesterday, I conducted pulse and word association tests. Fukiya showed almost no reaction. There were some questionable fluctuations in his pulse, but compared to Saito, it was negligible. Look at this. Here are the questions and the pulse recordings. Saito's reactions are quite pronounced. The same goes for the word association. Look at the reaction times for potted plant. Fukiya responded faster than to other neutral words, while Saito took 6 seconds. The word association record presented by Kasumori was as follows. Insert word association table, Fig 56646_01.png, 1225 by 2487. Caption: Circles indicate crime-related words. In practice, hundreds of words are used, often in 2 or 3 sets, administered in succession. This table is simplified for clarity. End caption. See? Quite clear, isn't it? Kasumori continued after Akechi had examined the records. This shows Saito is deliberately manipulating his responses. The slow reaction times are the most telling, affecting not only the target words but also the ones immediately following. Then there are his forced associations, iron for money, horse for steel. He clearly struggled with potted plant, likely suppressing money and pine. Fukiya, on the other hand, is completely natural. Pine for potted plant, hide for oilcloth, murder for crime. He readily gives incriminating associations with short response times. If he were the murderer, he'd have to be remarkably slow-witted. But he's a university student, and quite bright, as you know. That's one interpretation, Akechi said thoughtfully. Kasumori, oblivious to his knowing expression, continued. The problem is, While this clears Fukiya, I'm not convinced about Saito's guilt. Even if I find him guilty in the pre-trial hearings, it's not the final verdict. I'd usually be satisfied, but you know how I hate to lose. It would irk me to have my judgment overturned at trial. So, I'm still unsure. This is quite intriguing, Akechi said, studying the records. Both Fukiya and Saito seem studious, judging by their shared response of Maruzen to book. What's more interesting is the contrast between Fukiya's rather materialistic, intellectual responses and Saito's gentler, more emotional ones. His responses like woman, kimono, flower, doll, scenery, sister suggest a sentimental, sensitive man. And I suspect Saito is in poor health. Sickness for dislike and tuberculosis for sickness indicate a preoccupation with illness, likely a fear of tuberculosis. Interesting observation. The more you analyze these word associations, the more insights you gain. By the way, Akechi changed his tone slightly. Have you considered the limitations of psychological tests? De Quiros, criticizing Munsterberg, the proponent of these tests, argued that while intended to replace torture, they can, like torture, wrongly convict the innocent and acquit the guilty. Munsterberg himself admitted that while definitive in determining a suspect's knowledge of a specific place, person, or thing, psychological tests are unreliable in other circumstances. I apologize if this is stating the obvious, but it's a crucial point, don't you think? Yes, in the worst-case scenario, Kasamori replied with a frown. I'm aware of that, of course. But that worst-case scenario might be closer than you think. Consider a highly strung, innocent man suspected of a crime. He knows the crime scene and the details of the crime. Could he remain calm during a psychological test? He'd likely be agitated, thinking, they're testing me. How should I answer to avoid suspicion? Wouldn't a test under such circumstances precisely fit De Quiros's description of wrongly convicting the innocent? You're referring to Saito. Yes, I had a similar feeling, which is why I'm still undecided. Kasamori's frown deepened. Then, if Saito is innocent, though he's still guilty of theft, who killed the old woman? Kasamori interrupted Akechi's question, his tone sharp. Do you have another suspect in mind? I do, Akechi replied with a smile. Based on these word associations, I suspect Fukiya. I can't be certain yet, but he should be home by now. Could you summon him here discreetly? If so, I'm confident I can uncover the truth. What? Do you have concrete evidence? Kasamori asked, surprised. Akechi, without a hint of boastfulness, explained his reasoning, thoroughly impressing the magistrate. A messenger was dispatched to Fukiya's lodgings. Your friend, Mr. Saito, has been found guilty. I wish to discuss certain matters with you regarding this. Please come to my private residence. This was the summons. Fukiya, just returned from school, immediately complied. Overjoyed by the news of Saito's conviction, he failed to notice the trap being laid. Indent 8 characters 6. After explaining the reasons for Saito's conviction, Kasamori added, I truly apologize for having suspected you. I invited you today to explain the situation properly, by way of apology. He ordered tea for Fukiya and engaged in casual conversation, with Akechi joining in. Kasamori introduced Akechi as an acquaintance, a lawyer hired by the deceased woman's heir to handle debt collection and other matters. While partly fabricated, it was true that the old woman's nephew had arrived from the countryside to claim the inheritance. The conversation flowed easily, touching on various topics, including Saito's case. The relieved Fukiya was the most talkative of the three. As they talked, dusk settled outside. Fukiya, noticing the darkening sky, began to prepare to leave. I should be going. Is there anything else? Oh, I almost forgot, Akechi said brightly. It's a trivial matter, but since you're here. You see, there was a 2-paneled gold screen in the room where the murder occurred, and it seems there's a small tear in it, which has become a point of contention. The screen wasn't the old woman's, it was being held as collateral for a loan. The owner insists on compensation, claiming the damage occurred during the murder, while the old woman's nephew, a miser like his aunt, refuses, claiming it was already damaged. It's a tiresome issue. The screen is apparently quite valuable. Since you frequented the house, you might recall the screen. Do you remember if it was already damaged? You probably didn't pay much attention to a screen. I asked Saito, but he was too agitated to give a clear answer. The maid has returned to her village, and her responses to my letters have been unhelpful. It's quite a predicament. The screen being collateral was true, the rest was a fabrication. The word screen made Fukiya uneasy, however. The matter seemed trivial, and he was reassured. Why be nervous? The case is closed. He considered his response, deciding, as usual, that honesty was the best policy. As the magistrate knows, I was only in that room once, 2 days before the incident, he said with a chuckle, enjoying his apparent candor. But I remember the screen. There was no damage when I saw it. Are you sure? The tear is quite small, on Ono no Komachi's face. Yes, I remember now. Fukiya feigned sudden recollection. It depicted the 6 immortal poets. I remember Ono no Komachi. If there had been a tear then, I wouldn't have missed it. A tear on Komachi's brightly colored face would have been immediately noticeable. Would you mind testifying? The screen's owner is quite greedy and difficult. Certainly. Whenever it's convenient. Fukiya readily agreed to the supposed lawyer's request, feeling slightly smug. Thank you, Akechi said cheerfully, scratching his messy hair, a habit when slightly excited. Actually, I suspected you might know about the screen. In yesterday's word association test, you responded to picture with screen, a rather specific response. Here it is. He pointed to the record. Boarding houses rarely have screens, and you don't seem to have many close friends besides Saito. I assumed the screen in the old woman's room must have made a particular impression for some reason. Fukiya was startled. The lawyer was right. But why had he mentioned the screen yesterday? And how could he have been so oblivious until now? This was dangerous. But how? He had carefully examined the tear, confirming it offered no clues. No, it was fine. He reassured himself after some thought, but he was utterly, and fatally, wrong. And he didn't realize it. You're quite observant. I hadn't noticed that myself, Fukiya responded calmly, maintaining his facade of artlessness. Just a lucky observation, Akechi said modestly. But there's one more thing. Don't worry, it's nothing to be concerned about. There were 8 key words in yesterday's test, and you passed flawlessly, perhaps too flawlessly. If you had anything to hide, it wouldn't have been so perfect. Here are the 8 words, marked with circles. He showed Fukiya the marked section of the record. Your response times to these words, while only slightly, are all faster than your responses to other neutral words. For instance, you responded to potted plant with pine in just 0.6 seconds. Remarkably artless. The easiest association among the 30 words is probably blue for green, and even that took you 0.7 seconds. Fukiya felt a surge of anxiety. What was the lawyer's purpose in this detailed analysis? Was it friendly or malicious? He sensed an ulterior motive and struggled to understand it. Potted plant, oilcloth, crime, none of these key words are inherently easier to associate than head or green. Yet you responded to these more complex associations faster. What does this mean? This is what I noticed. Let me guess your strategy, just for fun. Correct me if I'm wrong. Fukiya shivered, though he couldn't explain why. You knew the dangers of psychological tests and prepared in advance. You had planned your responses to crime-related words. I'm not criticizing you. These tests can be quite dangerous, potentially convicting the innocent and acquitting the guilty. But your preparation was too thorough. You didn't intend to respond faster, of course, but you did. That was your critical mistake. You were so focused on avoiding delays that you didn't realize responding too quickly was equally dangerous. The time differences are minute, easily overlooked by a less observant examiner. But fabricated stories always have flaws. This was the crux of Akechi's suspicion. But why choose potentially incriminating words like money, murder, and hide? That's precisely your artlessness. A guilty person wouldn't respond to oilcloth with hide. Such candid responses demonstrate your innocence. Am I right? Fukiya stared at Akechi, unable to look away. The muscles around his mouth tightened, making any expression, laughter, tears, surprise, impossible. He couldn't speak. Any attempt would have resulted in a cry of terror. This artlessness, this lack of guile, is your defining characteristic. Knowing this, I set my trap. Do you understand? The screen. I knew you would answer honestly, artlessly, and you did. Kasamori, when was the 6 immortal poets screen brought to the old woman's house? Akechi asked innocently. The day before the murder. The 4th of last month. The day before? Really? That's odd. Fukiya just stated he saw it in the room 2 days before the murder, on the 3rd. Someone's mistaken. Fukiya must be misremembering, Kasamori chuckled. We have confirmed that the screen was in its owner's possession until the evening of the 4th. Akechi observed Fukiya's expression with keen interest. It was crumbling, like a young girl on the verge of tears. This was Akechi's carefully planned trap. He knew from Kasamori that the screen hadn't been in the house 2 days before the murder. This is problematic, Akechi said, feigning concern. A grave misstep. Why claim to have seen something you didn't? You weren't at the house 2 days before the murder. Remembering the 6 immortal poets is particularly damning. You were trying so hard to tell the truth that you ended up lying. Isn't that right? Did you pay attention to the presence or absence of a screen 2 days before the murder when you visited the room? Of course not. It was irrelevant to your plan. Even if there had been a screen, it was an antique piece, subdued in color, not particularly noticeable among the other furnishings. It's natural to assume that the screen you saw on the day of the murder was also there 2 days prior. Especially since I steered you in that direction with my questions. It's a kind of illusion, a common occurrence. An ordinary criminal wouldn't have responded like you. They believe concealment is everything. But your exceptionally sharp mind worked to my advantage. You believed that being as open as possible, except for crucial details, was safer than outright deception. Double deception. So, I went one step further. You never suspected that a lawyer, unrelated to the case, would set a trap to elicit a confession. Ha 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 ha. Fukiya, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead, remained silent. He knew any further defense would only worsen his situation. His intelligence allowed him to fully grasp the damning nature of his slip. Memories from his childhood flashed through his mind like a whirlwind. A long silence hung in the air. Do you hear that? Akechi asked after a while. That scratching sound? Someone in the next room has been recording our conversation. Could you bring that here, please? A young man entered, carrying a stack of papers. Please read it aloud, Akechi instructed. The young man began to read. Now, Fukiya, please sign this and affix your thumbprint. You won't object, will you? You just promised to testify about the screen. You might not have imagined this kind of testimony, though. Fukiya knew resistance was futile. He signed and stamped the document, acknowledging both his mistake and Akechi's brilliant deduction. He slumped, resigned. As I mentioned earlier, Akechi concluded, Munsterberg stated that psychological tests are only truly effective in determining a suspect's knowledge of a specific place, person, or thing. In this case, it was whether Fukiya had seen the screen. Without that, 100 psychological tests would have been useless against someone as meticulously prepared as Fukiya. One more thing, psychological tests don't require specific trigger words or specialized equipment, as described in textbooks. As I demonstrated, even everyday conversation can suffice. The great judges of old, like Uka Eshin, intuitively applied the methods of modern psychology without even realizing it.